Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. I mean, I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, but for me, in church leadership, we hear this all the time. I hear it all the time. Well, there are always two sides to every story, and we need to hear, we need to be fair, and we need to hear both sides of the story. The danger in that, and I do agree with that to an extent, but the danger in that is when you give an alleged abuser the floor, he's going to sweep it off you and have you twirling around and doing the do-si-do without you ever knowing it in a matter of seconds.
Yep.
And so for me, that's why I focus so much on, it's the P word that people don't like. So I've had to change that, but profiling, I've had to change that to observing. We need to have the ability to properly observe people and see, are they people who constantly violate boundaries, even if it's little subtle boundaries. Yeah, because that's what they do, right? It's that ambiguity, and they're just your abuser. I have no doubt in my mind that he was violating boundaries, that he was touching you and hugging you in ways that he shouldn't be doing right in front of other people. I have no doubt about it. And so it's one thing to sit down and hear both sides of the story, which I don't recommend leaders do because I know the outcome.
Right.
Plus, you shouldn't give an abuser the floor. That's just my thought.
Yeah.
But it's quite another thing to observe them. And I want to hear your take on that because from a preventative standpoint.
Well, I think there's always signs and red flags. It's how we decide to process those. And as you said in my book, there was one youth group leader who saw those signs, and she bluntly asked me. Of course, I denied anything. And when she confronted him, he didn't, normally a person who has been accused of something they didn't do, the first reaction is, oh my gosh, shock. I couldn't have done anything like that. Instead, he was angry at her. How dare you accuse me of something like that? I mean, that was a clear red flag. Instead of saying, what can I do to help prevent me from, doing this again? Or he became angry. Like, how dare you accuse me of something like that? I would never do anything like that. And his response back to her was, then you need to leave this church if you can't trust me. And that's a red flag right there. I have a husband, I have a son. I certainly don't want them accused of something they didn't do. But again, there would be signs, and there would be, as you say, you observe. And I think with an observation, yes, you'll see the signs that say, okay, this is leaning more toward he probably did this than not. Absolutely. And like I said, there were members of the congregation who would tell me later, I thought that was odd when I saw this or did this. But again, no one would come forward to say anything without feeling like they were accusing this wonderful person of doing something that no one could think he could possibly do.
I think that's another thing too. In the religious community, it's been so ingrained in us that you don't ever talk about people, don't talk about them behind their backs. If you do, it's too gossipy, it's too judgy, and you do get labeled. And so I constantly remind people there is a difference. We've got to have the discernment to realize the difference between gossip, which is slanderous. It is passing rumors that are unfounded and things like that. There's a difference between gossip and sharing information, and saying, hey, I have legitimate concerns that I actually witnessed, a hand slide across the small of the back and, kind of lingered there, or it started, he started rubbing or whatever it is. There's a radical difference between that and saying, I think that,
or I just don't like this guy,
or I just have a feeling that somebody is whatever. There's a radical difference. And I think we've got to retrain leaders, because it's got to start with leadership. We've got to retrain leaders to make that distinction for their congregation and say, look, if you have information to share, by all means, we want to hear that information.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have the freedom to share that information with each other.
And if predators know that's the standard of a congregation,
Mm-hmm.
they're less likely to stay at that congregation. If they know there's already, a policy in place that says this is how we're going to respond, this is what these are the code of ethics we expect from our pastors and our leaders, they're less likely than to stay at that church and find one that's going to be a little more freewheeling, so to speak.
Right.
It tells them ahead of time, we're on top of this, that we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. And we've got to stop rehiring these men. We've got to stop passing them along to the next church.
Thank you. Yes,
I mean, my abuser has a long history, by his own admittance, of sexual misconduct. Now, they weren't all children, but it's still sexual misconduct with adult women. And sexual abuse. Anytime you exploit a woman's vulnerability and her emotional instability, that's misconduct and abuse. You are abusing your position and your power, and you have no position in ministry, nor do you have any position to be moved to the next church because of that. But my abuser is still a pastor, which, and I did everything I could. I went to his superior. I went to his church elders. I went to his church leaders. I got the same response. We believe he's a wonderful person and he's changed and we're not going to do anything about it. And so he remains. But again, that's the con game he's used on all of them as well.
Yeah. What blows my mind about that is how, you had so much information that you gave them. And in my opinion, I think you did a phenomenal job of being really objective. Because again, that's one of the things that church leaders will use. Well, you're just, you didn't heal. You have bitterness in your heart.
You didn't forgive.
Yep. You didn't forgive. It's the Christian thing to move on. And so they'll place all that on your shoulders and say, well, you're just being what? Emotionally reactive.
Revenge.
Well, here's another thing. I remember Sandy a couple times going to one family in particular within our church and trying to say something about John, the way he truly mistreated me. And it was a mind game with him.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't at all see it that way, but they explained his out to me, such as, well, weren't you ever young once? Didn't you ever do things that, you're ashamed of now? And I think in your case too, that might have had some bearing on how people felt. You're a, young woman. He's a young man. After all, they will expect you to have the maturity to have made right decisions.
Yep.
And he knew that. He knew that when he chose you. He absolutely did.
Yes.
You were the right choice for him. And how sad that is. It's just, it's terrible. It is.
And you live with that hurt for the rest of your life. You live. It's hurtful to know that someone you thought should have been your spiritual guide, someone who should have cared about you, takes advantage of you, and really alters your life for the rest of your life. I mean, I have not let my abuse define me, but it changed me.
It sure does.
Every experience, good and bad, changes an individual, and I will always have to live with the fact that, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor. And I think part of the reason I had a hard time, it took me a while to say that I was an abuse victim, because I didn't want the label. I didn't want to be different, but I also there was a part of me that so desperately wanted to believe that there was something about him that cared about me. I didn't want to have to believe that he could so carelessly take my life and discard it the way he did. But I finally did come to that conclusion. I finally could understand it, but it took me a while. And I think when I talk to victims, it's hard to let go of that concept that, no, I think he did care about me in some ways. And yes, he did these terrible things, but I wanted him to care about me, and he didn't. He didn't.
Yeah. I think you're so right in everything that you said just there.
And when you talk about forgiveness, I mean, that's another issue that, no victim should ever be told they need to forgive someone for anything.
Correct.
That comes from within the heart. You don't tell someone. I mean, I've thought about this, but do we tell someone who's been raped that they need to forgive their rapist? I don't think so. But in the church, somehow God forgives you, so you should forgive him. In my case, I was told, well, his wife has forgiven him, so we need to forgive him. Well, there's forgiveness. There's a moral thing about forgiveness, but there's also the professional violation of what he did. And that is cause for removal. What he has done, you remove that person. Now, if you want to forgive him, if you want to give him counseling, whatever it is you want to do, but he violated the code of ethics of his profession. His ordination vows, he destroyed those when he took advantage of someone under his care. And he made that decision. That was a choice he made.
Right.
Yeah. And he did it over and over and over and over.
And most of them do. Yeah. It's never, seldom is it ever one time. Most of the time there is a pattern to these men and their behaviors. And that's what makes them so dangerous as well. They're good at what they do and they don't stop. Yeah. They don't stop. So when you rehire them, my elders knew of a first incident in his first church that this young woman came forward, and instead of doing the right thing, they said they're going to forgive him and let's let him continue in the ministry. And when they did that, they looked at me and said, we're going to risk you. We're going to risk your spiritual life so that this man can have a second chance at his ministry. I don't believe God ever meant for me or any of his other victims to be collateral damage so that he could continue in ministry. And that's exactly what church leaderships are telling their members of their congregation. We're going to risk you so that he can have a second chance or a third chance or a fourth chance. And they don't have a right to do that. They don't have a right to do that.
No. And that was one of the frustrating things about reading your book and hearing so many stories that we hear, because this story is replicated over and over and over again, where church leaders do know oftentimes. They're told, they're warned. In your case, you had an elder from another church from another state drive to the church and warn the elders in person and say, look, here's what he did when he was at our church. Here's why we fired him. You need to know. And they ignored that. And
through all that, they keep the congregation in the dark.
Yes.
Which is even more horrific. I don't agree with hiring someone. I mean, like I said, with my abuser, he's still a pastor. Okay, I can't do anything about that. But the fact that they keep that hidden from the congregation, it just blows my mind. I don't even know how to put words to that.
That's why I use the word calculated. They make when they choose to do that, the elders, whoever's in charge, they're making a very calculated decision also. Yeah. And they are to be held at a much higher standard than
because they're the enablers.
Yes.
They've enabled it. Yes.
Yes. And it blows my mind also. I just don't get it. I really don't.
Yeah, this is kind of my mantra with church leaders. In fact, in the John Ortberg story, I was just quoted saying this, but my mantra is, it's unfortunate that church leaders have the benefit of being in the know and the power to keep everybody else in the dark. Right. In other words, they all can protect their daughters and their granddaughters from this man because they all know what he is. They know what he's capable of. They know what he did. So I guarantee you these guys wouldn't let their teenage daughters spend any alone time with him, yet they have the power to keep the entire congregation in the dark. And for what? Yeah. And that's what's frustrating.
And again, pastors should be no different, and actually should be held to a higher standard than any other profession. That whether you're a doctor, a teacher, a counselor, you have an oath that says, I am going to look out for the best interests of that person under my care. And if a doctor's found having sex with his patient, he loses his license. He never can practice again. All of those standards are applied to the secular world, but sadly, they don't apply to pastors. There's only 13 states that is against the law for a pastor, rabbi, priest to have any kind of sexual relationship with someone under their care if they're counseling them. Just 13 states. The rest of the states, it's not against the law. This man can take you into a counseling session, learn about your vulnerabilities, your hurt, your pain, and then use that against you. And it's not against the law. And yet, if he were a doctor, a teacher, It is against the law, and they lose that profession. But we don't have that same standard to our pastors, and that we need to get to that point to
That
say
needs to change.
Yeah.
Yes.
it needs to change. That this
does.
your standard is the same as it would be for anyone else, and we're not there. We're not even close to being there. And I had one pastor say to me, "Well, you keep calling it a job and a profession. It's a calling." I said, "Well, I think you get a paycheck. I think you're expected to show up
Yeah.
on Sunday mornings.
Absolutely.
It's a job.
It-
You have a job to do, and if you don't
Any
do
of them
that
sign
job,
Absolutely.
contracts? I mean, come
Yeah.
on.
Absolutely,
please.
it's
Yeah.
a job.
Come on.
yeah, it's a
Right.
profession, and so it should be treated as such that
Yes.
when you break the oath of your profession, if a stockbroker is found with inside trading, he loses his license. No questions asked. So
Mhm.
a pastor who has any kind of sexual contact with a member of his congregation, regardless of her age, but certainly a minor, that's against the law.
Right.
That is a crime. And there should be no discussion on how to handle it. The elders don't have to have a meeting. You report it to the police. End of discussion. That's it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's amazing that churches circumvent the law twice, at least, when it is with a minor victim. Because first of all, I think now in almost all 50 states, it's clergy are mandated reporters.
Yeah.
When it's a minor victim, you have to report. It's a criminal offense to not report an allegation of sexual abuse, or a reasonable suspicion of
Right.
sexual abuse with the minor. Okay, so the vast majority of them will not report, even though they're mandated reporters. So they circumvent the law and fail miserably in that regard. But then with the sex offender registries, this is another scenario that just makes me so irritated, because these guys get out of prison. They're on the public registry for a reason. The sex offender registry was not created to paint a target on people who've changed their lives and are never a threat to people again. They put people on the registry. They create these laws to inform people of what the people actually followed through with and did. The criminal activity that they did to shatter somebody's life as a minor child when they did not have a choice. They could not resist. This person was over them in age and authority and power. So when churches fail to inform their churches when somebody's on the sex offender registry, whether they're preaching or a volunteer or just a lay member, they're circumventing the law. They're saying our decision to not inform the church that this person is on the registry, even though we know, is a decision where we feel like this law is unfair.
It's a warning. The registry is meant to be a warning.
Absolutely.
So if you keep that warning away from your congregation, you're putting them at risk. You're willing to put them at risk.
Absolutely.
And letting these predators come back into the fold, it's ludicrous. We are, the safety of our congregations should be utmost of importance, and we don't do that. We don't do that. My abuser could not get a job anywhere in this country teaching school. He could not get a job anywhere in this country, and yet he still remains with good standing within the denomination, and he can still preach. He can still have control over people. He can do all the things he would normally have done prior to his being exposed. And but he couldn't get a job.
Question, Sandy. Do you think that the time frame between what happened and when you were actually able to disclose your story has a lot to do with how people think of this person? In other words, do they think, well, she waited all these years and now is, she's out to destroy his home life, his family, the church. Why didn't she speak up then? And after all, that was in his youth, in his younger years. He's, asked for forgiveness, forgive him, put that behind him. She needs to move on. That's so
everything you just said was said to me. Everything you just said was said to me. One of the letters in the back of the book was written by his superior, and he clearly points out this happened 27 years ago. It has no validity to where we are today. I read something the other day that said the average age of sexual abuse of children is between 4 and 5. The average age to come forward is 52.
Yes.
And I was 49 when I
And
finally was
were
able
you?
to talk
Yes.
about it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
again, I think churches should understand victims come forward. We're not looking. Sometimes it's just we need to heal, and we need to be able to
Right.
have someone acknowledge what was done to us was wrong. And the legal suits come after we get stonewalled by the church most of the
Yes.
time.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's when then
Yeah.
our anger
Yeah.
becomes, no victim wakes up and says, I was sexually abused and I'm going to sue the church.
Right.
They wake up with pain and hurt and they want an
Well,
acknowledgement from it.
And no victim
yes.
says, let me go on record so that this is public information and people
Right.
can see my story.
Mhm.
No survivor ever does that.
I didn't even go to the congregation. I clearly went to him and his one superior. That's where I started.
Right.
I started there. And then I was told, well, and there were actions that my abuser did afterwards that showed me he was not a changed person. And that I
Right.
found myself becoming, frightened that this man still was a danger.
Mhm.
And so then I went to his other superiors, and then to the next set of hierarchy. And I each time I was told, this isn't important to us now. Or I was told, because we're an independent church, we have no control over what this particular church does.
Yeah.
I went through and wrote out some questions, and one of my questions to you was, would you call this time frame in your life carrying a 27-year trauma? Because that's how I see it. It just, when that trigger, when you saw that name, that place where so much had happened, you described yourself as just grabbing that steering wheel of the car and sobbing, pulling over. And I picture this as all those years of inner turmoil, pain, and trauma just finally spewing out. Finally, it was able to start.
It was like an eruption. It really was like an eruption. And to think about, I mean, I have a wonderful husband, but for 27 years, I hid this from him. And so that's not healthy in a marriage. That in itself creates a disconnect that I didn't need to have with him, but I had it because of the guilt and shame that I felt. I couldn't have the same kind of connection with my friends. When they would talk about their high school years, I had to figure out a way, okay, how can I talk about this and this person I dated but really didn't date? I mean, it was constant for me. And of course, church life was extremely difficult for me. The spiritual damage done to me, every single time that I walked past the minister's office, I got a knot in my stomach. For 27 years, that's how I responded. Yeah. And it became my norm. It just became my norm. That unhealthy 27 years, and no one would have suspected it. I mean, my life was pretty good, and no one would have suspected that this was a burden that I was carrying. But as I said, and as you described from my book, that moment that it all erupted, it came out and I couldn't push it back down. I had to deal with it. It wasn't going to go back down there again. And honestly, I got to the point where I thought, I'm going to my grave with this. I am going to finally make it where no one's ever going to learn this about me. And I felt, this is good. No one's ever going to find out. But what I found out is, what happened to me was done to me. It wasn't something I did. It wasn't something that I could have controlled. It was done to me. And so that was a burden that I had to learn to forgive myself. And that being able to do that was very healing for me.
I think that's a huge first step in healing, is learning to forgive ourselves, because we do carry such a guilty feeling, as if we did something wrong. We were the enablers. We were the ones that caused this, not that wonderful person.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's hard for victims to come, because we always want to say, well, what if I had said this? What if I had done this? What if? Right. And the point is, we were targeted. They knew exactly what they were doing. And it's the wolf in sheep's clothing. Yes. They look for the vulnerable. They go after the weakest prey. And he knew exactly what he was doing. They all do. Yes. This isn't by accident. This didn't happen by accident. It wasn't a mistake. He said to me, well, after one of my many debacles, he called it a debacle. Mm-hmm. That's what he said to me. No, a debacle is when you lose your luggage at the airport. That's a debacle.
Yeah.
What you did to me was not a debacle.
No. No.
But that's where their mindsets are. Like you said, with your dad, they minimize what they did.
Yeah,
They
constantly.
On all levels. And I think in the ministry, such as you experienced, on that level of abuse, that is so harmful. I feel like it takes forever to kind of get where you were spiritually, to get back on that plane where you can trust again. Just that betrayal, that horrible, horrible betrayal.
I mean, it truly contaminates your spiritual life and the trigger factors that you have when you're in church. So many victims totally turn off to God and are atheists. I mean, and that's understandable because of what was done to them within the walls of the church. And people don't quite understand either. I tell people, when you talk to a victim of clergy abuse, you need to be mindful of the things that you find comforting, like prayer, Bible study, going to church. Those are all things that can be trigger factors for victims. So don't be so quick to quote scripture. Don't be so quick to say, oh, let me pray with you. Because as my abuser did, they're going to pray with you after they had sex with you. Or I watched him give a sermon on Sunday morning and talk about loving his wife when he had sex with me the night before. So those things are ingrained in us. And so it's very difficult for victims of clergy abuse to have someone, and when you're in a faith community and when you're with people who have that faith, that's where they want to go. They want to go to Bible verses and tell you that God's with you, and they want to pray with you. And that's understandable, but it's not helpful to the victim of clergy abuse.
That's right.
Not at all. So if their goal is to help that victim, I remember I was with one woman and she said to me, I can understand that prayer can be difficult. Would you mind if I pray with you? And I said, yes, I would mind. I'm not ready to do that. And she was very accepting of that.
Yes.
So
I think the more we speak about this, the more helpful it will be to others, because you're right. People within the faith community do want to pray with you and do want to invite you to church. And that may not be what's good right now.
I mean, the best thing you can say to a victim of clergy abuse, the first thing is to tell them it's not their fault. Yep. But the second thing is to acknowledge that their spiritual life may be in disarray and that they may be confused. Just acknowledge it and let them lead you to where they are spiritually. And if church life is difficult and they can't get back to a 4-building wall church, that's okay. You let them know that's okay, because over time that may change, and it's only going to change and be helpful to them if they're allowed to have those feelings. And I told one victim said to me, I feel bad because I don't feel like I can trust God and believe in God anymore. And I said to her, God knows why you feel that way, and he's a big enough God to accept that.
And I love that.
Yeah,
yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I really struggle with churches that guilt and shame people for not being there, because they just assume that laziness is precluded in that you just don't care enough about God, you don't care enough about church, you know, those assumptions again. The brain makes all kinds of
and
it makes all kinds. But even if they don't know about the abuse, or if they do, it doesn't really change much, unfortunately. But they just assume that church attendance is equivalent to faithfulness to God.
Right.
And so they assume the opposite of that is true, that the lack of church attendance means unfaithfulness to God. And so their goal is to get you back in the 4 walls of the place where you're being triggered, where you don't need to be. And that's what, like, I emphasize it a lot and say, there's so many times when Jesus takes people with severe trauma and he doesn't tell them to come. There were some people who begged to follow Jesus and he said, no, go home and be with your family. Or he'll say, go in peace. He says it repeatedly to people. And I love that.
Sandy, in your book, you take us on a walk with you through this journey that is so is detailed in such a way that we can feel part of what you were feeling.
Yeah.
And I just encourage so many people to get a copy of the book.
Yeah,
I truly do.
Good.
You've done like this such good work with telling your story. how it unfolded, how it all happened, the trap that was set, and how you got out of the trap finally.
Yeah.
And that's the biggie. How you
Well,
finally,
I wrote the book because, in part, because I think our stories are important. Your story is important. My story is important
right.
because each
Yes.
of our stories resonates in a different way with different
Right.
people. And so we all need, if we're capable, to say, here's my story so that it can be helpful to someone else. For 27 years, I was in a prison. So hopefully my story might let someone else break out of their own prison.
And I believe it will. Yes.
And I also wrote it because I wanted to educate those who didn't quite get how this happens and what is clergy sexual abuse and why don't they say no and why do they wait so long?
Right.
Our stories are important. Each one of us has a story that needs to be told, and so that each person can relate to someone else that maybe my story doesn't necessarily relate to. But I am thankful that I wrote the book. It was difficult to write. I found myself at times not being able to write at all, but here's, and the other motivating factor, probably the most motivating factor for me, is I kept remembering and thinking about that time in my life, and I really thought that I was the only one this was happening to.
Yeah.
What would have changed in my life if I had heard someone else's story of abuse at the time it was being done to me?
How helpful, yes.
And I didn't have that. I didn't have someone's story. And we are so much better off today with the internet and with, this topic being discussed like we are today. We didn't have that when I was being sexually abused by my youth pastor. But I thought if my story would have resonated at some time with someone it's happening to them now, or they're trying to heal from it. Healing's the hardest part, I think.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, to move past it, to be able to, and I don't say you don't ever remember it or you forget it or it's just not a part of it's always a part of your life. It's always it's part of who you are. You just don't want it to define your life.
Right.
And at some point I was able to forgive him. But when I talk about forgiveness, it doesn't mean I'm silent about what he did to me. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences. And it doesn't mean that I forget. It just means that I let myself let go of it. That I'm not going, because for 27 years I had guilt and shame. And then after I was able to talk about it, I had hurt and anger. So for 27 years, the guilt and anger was controlling me. Now I had the hurt and the pain controlling my life. And while it seemed like it was hurt and anger, it was really still him controlling me. As long as I allowed him to be a part of my life through the hurt and pain, he was still there. Exactly. And I didn't want him there anymore. Right. So the only way to get rid of him was to say, I'm done with him. I'm done with the anger. I'm done with the pain. I'm not going to let that be a part of my life. I wanted to live the life that I was meant to live, and not the one created by him, and not the one that the abuse damaged. I wanted my life back. And the only way I could get that back was to let go. And that's what forgiveness means to me.
And that is, I think, just a beautiful kind of a summary of, I had one more question, Sandy, if you're up for it.
Oh, sure.
If you had to leave our listeners with just one takeaway from all of this, what would that be?
Well, I need two.
Okay.
One would be
have as many as you want.
Good. Okay.
My husband would tell you, she'll never tell you one thing.
Okay.
Well, first of all, to victims, I want healing is possible. You can heal from your abuse, and don't let this abuse define you. And whatever happened to you was not your fault. The second thing I would want to say and leave the listeners with is to learn all you can about clergy sexual abuse, and learn the dynamics of it, and learn about grooming, learn what manipulation is, what is gaslighting, love bombing, because until the outside world, until the church itself learns and understands the concept and the dynamics of clergy sexual abuse, we're never going to be able to respond in the way that we should, because we're always going to see it as a mistake, or we're going to see it as a moral fall that we should be forgiving these men for. And that's not what it is. So we need to understand the dynamics and the concepts. And there's your blogs, your website, my book. There are Marie Fortune's out there with a book. There's a wealth of information that if you really want to understand clergy sexual abuse and what it does and how we should respond to it, we need to learn about it, and then we can deal with it.
Yeah.
And that to me is that's what's going to be the key to move forward from all of this.
Thank you so
I have a
much.
burning question.
Okay.
We'll end with this.
Okay.
That would be a perfect question, but I have to ask it. As a church leader myself, as a minister, as somebody who had to walk a church through the aftermath of abuse, report a church member, report my own father, what would a good church response have looked like for you? If you could go back in time and say, best case scenario, how would have that church, what would have meant a lot to you back when you were being abused?
I think the first thing would have been that they would have removed him and said what he did was wrong and he needs to be removed. The second thing would have been to take me aside and say to me, this was not your fault. And this should never have happened in our church. And we're going to do whatever we can to make you whole again, to help you to get through this journey of healing, counseling, whatever it is that we need to do, we're going to do for you. And third, they would have informed the congregation, this is what happened, and explained that this is not the fault of anybody but the pastor himself. There's to be no pointing of fingers. There's to be no blame to be shifted any place else than the person who caused these actions, and that was this pastor. And he's going to be removed. That's what would have looked to me and would have been helpful to me. And that's what it should look like. No questions asked. We're not going to make excuses. This is what we as a body want to look Christ-like, is to support the vulnerable, support this child of God who was devoured by one of our own, and he's no longer one of ours.
Yes, that's very powerful. Thank you.
It is.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, Sandy, we can't thank you enough for being with us, and I can't emphasize enough that your book is a must read. It was very gripping. It's very good. It gave me a lot to reflect on as a church leader. I wish that every church leader would read this book. If they were to pick one book and say, what's it like to be in the shoes of an abuse victim within our congregation, within the four walls of our church, this would be the book that I would pick.
So I appreciate that. Like I said, that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, very helpful for church leaders.
It's been a delight speaking with both of you. I enjoy your podcast. I recommend your blogs. I'm so glad we were able to connect today.
Been wonderful.
Very good. Thank you so
much.
Thank you.
To our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.